character is the most important trait of a leader. Now, I define character a little bit differently, and this comes from my West Point experience, where character is putting the needs of the organization above yourself. In the Army, I learned that I always ate after the soldiers who were in my unit. Now, it wasn't that we were going to run out of food, but it was a symbology of the officer eating after the soldiers. That's important, because if you're going into a battle with a group of men, those men want to know that you think their life is more important than yours. So that's very, very important. Now, Collins talks about this in his business books, too, Built to Last, Good to Great. He talks about what's called level 5 leadership. And he says level 5 leadership is when your leader's ambition is for the success of the organization and not for themselves. If your ambition is for yourself, the people who work for you are going to figure that out. They're going to know that, and they're not going to want to follow you. So place your ambition for the organization. In fact, in Good to Great, what Collins found out is that the really great leaders were the ones who weren't very well publicly known, because their ambition was all for the organization. So that's an important part of character, is having your ambition for the organization rather than yourself. Another part of it, and this isn't necessarily popular in our society today in the United States, is the idea of taking personal responsibility. Taking personal responsibility is an important trait of character. You know, wouldn't you like to work for someone who takes personal responsibility? You know, what would you rather have happen? Something goes wrong in the organization, and your boss's boss comes to your boss and says, something went wrong, and your boss says, oh, I don't understand why that went wrong. It wasn't my fault. It was Sally's fault. If Sally had only done her job right, you don't want to work for that person. You want to work for somebody who says, that was my fault. Now, I learned this very early. I learned this my first day at West Point. My first day at West Point, your first year, you're what's called a plebe. And that's the lowest form of life on earth. At least that's what we were told. And during that first year, we learned that and that first day, actually, we learned we only had 4 answers to any situation. So imagine I'm walking out to formation. My shoes are shined. My trousers are pressed. And Scott steps in the mud puddle and sprays me with mud. So I've got mud all over my shoes and my trousers. I'm walking out to formation. Joe comes up to me because he's an upperclassman and says, McDonald, you toolbox. What happened to your trousers and your pants? How come didn't you polish your shoes? Didn't you press your trousers? You know, what's the problem? I started running through my 4 answers because I knew I only had 4 answers. I could say, yes, sir, to Joe. But if I did that, that's kind of obvious. I'm already a mess. You know, that's not going to push the ball forward. I could say, no, sir. But if I said, no, sir, I would commit an honor violation. I'd get thrown out of the school because I obviously was a mess. I could say, sir, I do not understand. That was my 3rd answer. And I tried that. I tried, sir, I do not understand for many months. And they sent me to the hospital for an audiology test. You know, with the thing you press, you hear the beeps, you know. I'm a very slow learner. I'm not very smart, but I finally figured out that the answer, the 4th answer was the one they wanted me to use, which was, no excuse, sir. No excuse, sir. In other words, you take responsibility when something goes wrong, even when it appears to be outside your control. Now, who do you want to work for? Do you want to work for somebody who takes responsibility, even when it appears outside their control? Or do you want to work for somebody who's going to blame you for something that goes wrong in the organization or look to place blame elsewhere? Now, be careful with this. Some of you said that you're parents. You've got to be really careful with this. Everything we talk about in leadership is applicable to the experience of parenting. I made the mistake of teaching my children some of the things I've learned about leadership at West Point and other places. So I trained my daughter and my son. One day, my wife and I go up to the room of my daughter. The room is a mess. It was a Saturday. She had gone out to play with her friends, and her room was a mess. She hadn't cleaned up her room. My wife and I run downstairs. This is terrific. We found something wrong. It's a teaching occasion. We got out all our books, Dr. Spock and everything else. We wrote up our little speech for Jennifer for when she comes back to school. Fortunately, she survived it and went to Duke. But, you know, we had our speech all ready for Jenny. Jenny walks in. She runs up to her room. Deanne, my wife, and I go up after her. We confront her. Jenny. She says, Dad, don't say anything. Don't say anything. She said, Dad, I have no excuse. I know I should have cleaned up my room. I should have set priorities properly. I didn't do it. I have no excuse. And my wife and I look at each other. What are we going to do? We just spent an hour on this speech. We got every baby book downstairs, and we used it. So be careful how you teach people this no excuse idea. It's a very, very powerful idea. Once somebody takes responsibility and says it won't happen again, there's not much else to say. But taking responsibility is an important part of character. Number 5, this is not number 5, this is number 4. It's another important saying that I learned at West Point. It's part of the cadet prayer. It's help me to choose the harder right rather than the easier wrong. This is so applicable in business. So applicable in business. If you're doing something and it feels really easy, stop doing it. It's probably wrong. On the other hand, if you want to do the right thing, it's going to feel really hard. Really, really hard. And I got to tell you, the Procter & Gamble company for 172 years, I think, has chosen the harder right rather than easier wrong. And it's hard to do. It's hard to do. But if you do it, the enterprise will continue to survive and flourish for 172 years. If you choose the easier wrong, you're going to make a mistake, and that's probably what happened to the 41 of those companies that fell off the Fortune 50 list since 1955. Number 5, this is something I learned from anybody know Dr. Edwards Deming? Have you ever heard of Dr. Edwards Deming? Total Quality, the father of total quality. Statistician that went to Japan and taught Japanese companies how to make high-quality products. It's one of the reasons Toyota is so successful today. Diverse groups of people are more innovative than homogeneous groups of people. This is something we believe in at Procter & Gamble. We want our workforce to look like the consumers we're trying to serve. So if we have left-handed consumers, we want left-handed employees. If we have female consumers, we want female employees. We know that diverse groups of people are more innovative than homogeneous groups of people. In fact, we know that innovation never happens in a straight line. If you think of, there's a fellow named James Burke. He produced a television show called Connections. Anybody seen it? Connections, or have you read the book Connections? If you're interested in innovation, I would suggest you watch this show or read this book. James Burke, I think, was a professor at Cambridge University. He produced this program for PBS. It was on in the 80s, but it's still available today through Netflix or Blockbuster. But the idea is that innovation never happens in a straight line, and things never turn out as they were expected to turn out. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone to help hearing impaired people. He never expected every household to have a phone. He certainly never expected the cell phone. Marconi invented the radio for ships to communicate at sea. He never expected the radio to come on land. He certainly never expected for every automobile to have a radio. Thomas Watson, this is my favorite. That's Thomas Watson with one of the world's first computers. Thomas Watson said, the founder of IBM, said that someday the United States may need 2 or 3 computers. Now, it sounds ludicrous, right? But why was the computer invented? Well, Thomas Watson invented the computer in the United States to take the census. And people would go door to door and fill out these little cards called Hollerith cards or punch cards. They would be read by the machine, and the computer would tabulate the census. So, of course, you don't need more than 2 or 3 computers to tabulate the census every few years. He never expected every household to have a computer. He certainly never expected your car today to have more computing power than the mainframe computer I worked on in West Point in 1975. But that's how things change. Change is constant. Change will always occur. And innovation occurs when you connect 2 seemingly disconnected ideas. So the reason diversity is important is diversity provides those disparate nodes that can be used to connect. And certainly one of the advantages of our company is we operate over 90 countries around the world. Our products are sold in over 200 countries. we're interfacing with consumers all over the world. We're gaining that knowledge, and that knowledge then can help us provide the nodes and the connections in order to be an innovative company. So diversity sparks innovation. If you're working on a team here in Fuqua, make sure your team is diverse. If your team is diverse, I posit that you will get a better product from that team than if you have a more homogeneous team.